Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Chip Gibbons, and I am the Policy Director of Defending Rights in Dissent, an organization which proudly defends your right to know and your freedom to act. It's a little after 3 o'clock here in Washington, D.C., 2 o'clock in Chicago, and noon on the West Coast. We recently marked the 20th anniversary of the tragedy of 9/11, when nearly 3,000 Americans were senselessly murdered. The Bush administration chose to harness our grief, our sorrow, our outrage to launch a global war on terror, ram through Congress a wish list of increased surveillance powers long desired by those who want to roll back the necessary but insufficient checks placed on intelligence agencies in the 70s, and smeared anyone who objected as an enemy within. On September the 14th, Congress voted for an 2001, obviously, Congress voted for an authorization for the use of military force against those responsible for the attacks and those who harbored them. 4 days later, on the 18th, Bush signed it into law. Most people in Congress understood this as a green light for the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, but it was in fact a blank check for war, which Bush interpreted as authorizing a global war without boundaries, borders, or limits on presidential power. Disturbingly, Mr. Bush claimed this meant the U.S. was a battlefield, and the war president had war powers against his own people. Bush's successors, Obama and Trump, cemented and expanded the war on terror with dismal milestones like the first drone strike against a U.S. citizen or the use of the Espionage Act to jail journalists and whistleblowers. In the last presidential election, for those of us who remember the very disturbing post 9/11 atmosphere, both major parties devoted time at their conventions to calls to end the forever wars or the endless wars. You can interpret the sincerity of those statements however much you want, but it represents at the very least a dramatic sign of how the American people have turned on the war on terror. Biden, citing this pledge, has started to end the ground war in Afghanistan. In the early 90s, Defending Rights in Dissent participated in a campaign called End the Cold War at Home, arguing with the Cold War winding down, the repressive domestic legislation, which should never have been passed in the first place, had no purpose and must be repealed. Today, we argue that ending our forever war must include not just the war in Afghanistan or the air wars in countries Congress never intended to authorize military action, but ending the war at home, repealing the Patriot Act, ending warrantless surveillance, putting checks on the FBI, and closing the notorious Guantanamo Bay prison camp. To discuss this, we are joined by an excellent panel, including Marjorie Cohen, the former president of the National Lawyers Guild, a frequent recidivist on these programs. If you watch our programs regularly, you've seen Kevin Gostola before. He is a journalist, an editor. He curates the Dissenter newsletter and is managing editor of Shadowproof. He is a fearless independent journalist who shows us why the First Amendment guarantee to press freedom is so important. And we're also joined by Ashik Sadiq from the National Priorities Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. We also have been teasing online that we had a surprise guest. Originally, Leena Al-Arian from the Civil Coalition for Civil Freedom was supposed to join us, but she could not make it today. We're joined by her father, a former political prisoner and victim of the war on terror, Dr. Sami Al-Arian, and we are super honored and super privileged to have him joining us today.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. I want to start with you, Marjorie, since you've practiced criminal law. You also are a renowned scholar of both constitutional and international law. So you're about one of the most qualified people, I think, to explain this to our audience today. What is the ramifications for civil liberties for the president to declare that the U.S. is part of a global battlefield and that his actions at home are just as much war actions as those in Afghanistan or Somalia or wherever else? And is there any solid legal footing for this type of claim?
Well, Bush declared a war on terror after the 9/11 attacks, which were not armed attacks by another country, which they were crimes against humanity and should have been punished as such, and not resulted in the illegal invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq and use of drones in, I think, 7 countries under Obama and counting, and Trump and Biden have continued these illegal drone strikes. But when Bush declared a war on terror, terrorism is a tactic. It's not an enemy. And you don't declare war on a tactic. And yet, under the guise of this so-called global war on terror, hundreds or thousands of men and boys have been tortured, indefinitely detained, and at home, our civil liberties have been severely curtailed. Now, in particular, 3 developments on Bush's watch have had a chilling effect on protected First Amendment activity. First, the shift from reactive to preemptive law enforcement. And we see that in the protests in the wake of the torture and murder of George Floyd. We also see the enactment of domestic anti-terrorism laws, the Patriot Act, material support for terrorism, which has been used to go after Palestinians and Muslims and anyone that the government thinks dissents against its policy, and also the relaxation of FBI guidelines on the surveillance of people in this country. Now, I'll stop there.
Oh, that's an excellent answer. And I think people don't necessarily always comprehend the full significance of the shift to preemptive policing. Somebody shared with us FBI training materials they had from the early sort of war on terror period. And first of all, they look like they were written for grade schoolers. I showed them to a former FBI agent, and he was shocked they were for adults. But one of the things that was scrawled in the margin in the notes was FBI no longer prosecutes terrorism as a crime. They try to prevent it before it happens. And that has all kinds of shocking implications. Dr. Sami Al-Arian, I think it's fair to say that you were individually impacted the most by the war on terror. By anyone on this panel, you were a longtime fighter for civil rights for Arab and Muslim Americans throughout the 90s and throughout the 2000s. You also became the victim of a political persecution by the Bush administration. Could you explain to the audience in 3 to 4 minutes at most what you experienced after 9/11?
First of all, thank you for inviting me, and I'd like to thank the organizations putting this together, and I've been fighting very hard against these repressive measures. Of course, I was monitored for 10 years. I found out during my discovery that I have been under surveillance, all my phone numbers or whatever number I had access to, whether at work, at school, at home, my wife, my children, every telephone I could have access to was being monitored, 18 lines in total. They had 21,000 hours of surveillance tapes. That was part of evidence supposedly against me. I was also physically surveyed for several years. They had all these surveillance tapes. So I was under their monitoring system because of my activism, whether it was for Palestine or whether it was for civil rights. And of course, it turned out that there were several teams, local teams as well as national teams in Washington, D.C., that they had me. I think my trial and pre-trial probably cost in the neighborhood of $200 million. I mean, it was outrageous. But it was all based on political associations and political opinions. And believe it or not, part of the evidence that was presented to the jury in my trial were articles I wrote, conferences I convened, speeches I gave, articles that I didn't write, but I approved as an editor of a magazine. In one instance, even a dream, believe it or not, of my co-defendant who was reciting a dream that he saw me in his dream. And that dream was recited to the jury as evidence against me. Well, it had to do something with Palestine. And I was telling my lawyer it wasn't even my dream. But yet I had to face that kind of thing. But the amount of surveillance, when I read recently an article about Terry Albury, a former FBI agent, who released much of these documents to the Intercept. He was caught and prosecuted, and the New York Times had a full expose about him. Most of these techniques, most of these tactics, tools used, I have seen, I have experienced, and it was something that is very chilling. Our community in Tampa, the FBI visited almost every single house just to instill that kind of fear in them, so that my family and I would not have the support. Luckily, I had a lot of people locally, non-Muslims, and they were the ones who were showing up to the trial and showing lots of support.
And Semi, what's the ultimate outcome in your case?
Well, it's interesting because the government wasn't ready when the trial started. I didn't waive my speedy trial. The judge did. I said, I'm ready, go. The government said, Judge, we're not ready. So they had 400,000 documents. They dumped on us another 65,000 documents in Hebrew just to throw us away. They presented 80 witnesses. They had 600 videotapes, 2,000 audio tapes, 21,000 hours of recordings. They used hundreds of phone calls in that trial, brought 80 witnesses, and over 5 months. By the way, my trial from opening to verdict is probably the longest trial continuously, 6 months. And when it came to our turn, we presented 0 witnesses. We had no witnesses whatsoever. And yet they were not able to convict us on a single count out of 100 and plus counts, and with 4 defendants.
And you eventually agreed to a plea.
What happened? What happened is that 2 of the jurors, after they acquitted the team on 78 counts, there were few left, and then they refused to deliberate. And the judge gave them the instruction that they should at least give it they don't have to vote with the majority, but they should deliberate. And then the judge, unfortunately, looked at the verdicts, and he saw a lot of people thought it was going the other way, that they convicted 2 and waiting for 2. But the fact of the matter is that the jurors were 10 to 12 in our favor, and the last 2 refused to deliberate. So the judge, when he saw this, he stopped the trial the second day to give the government another chance. And then, of course, by that time, you lost your lawyers. You have to hire new lawyers. It cost $1 million by that time. You don't have another $1 million. They lost the conspiracy because 2 were acquitted outright. And the reason they had a conspiracy because they didn't have any evidence. So they wanted to bring a lot of people, a lot of information, throw it at the jury, hoping that they can find some kind of a conspiracy that didn't exist. And of course, they basically told us, plead to anything and you're out. And my lawyer told me, you can't, this is your best outcome. I consulted 13 lawyers, and that's what they told me. And I basically, we wrote the plea agreement, basically nonsense, that you didn't tell about the name of a person to a journalist, or you hired a lawyer for a brother-in-law, something just for them to say that, okay, the trial is over. But unfortunately, after we did this, the agreement was that I should go back and leave, give up all my rights in the United States after, decades, and leave. But when that happened, when the government went back in another jurisdiction and they tried to drag me, and I stayed after that for another 9 years.
And the prosecutor in the other jurisdiction, for people watching, was Gordon Kromberg, who I had the misfortune of seeing in court recently, because he was also the prosecutor who pushed the Daniel Hale prosecution, and he is as awful in person as you would imagine him to be. Kevin, you frequently join us for discussions on the ongoing war on whistleblowers and journalists. One of the whistleblowers you've recently written about, who Sammy mentioned, is Terry Albury. Could you explain for the viewers at home who is Albury, and what does his story tell us about the war on terror at home? Kevin? You're muted.
Hey, okay, I was being considerate, and then I flubbed up. Let me go back. Terry Albury is a whistleblower who was convicted under the Espionage Act. He's a former special FBI agent and a black man who has a lot of experience with the sort of programs that we're all committed to ending. And he took a lot of courage, but as profiled by Janet Rettman in New York Times Magazine in the first part of this month, we get a lot of details and information about what was going through Terry's mind. And it's unfortunate that someone with his conscience went to prison and was sentenced to 4 years in prison. But I think, when you compare agencies, often these are treated as like rival agencies. But when you go between the FBI and CIA, I think there's a tendency to look at what the CIA did and the fact that they were implicated in a brutal and heinous torture program is how we view them. And that's how we should view them. But then what happens is people think that the FBI has done everything by the book, that it's been pretty much a kind of a civil agency when it comes to handling terrorism over the last 20 years. It's just simply not the case, because in fact, when you started in the first months after the September 11th attacks, what Attorney General John Ashcroft had the Bureau doing was rounding up people on suspicion of immigration violations and hiding up to 1,200 people indefinitely in detention, and then ultimately deporting them, deporting a huge majority of those people on immigration violations, so they weren't allowed to stay in the country. And so Terry comes up through the ranks of the FBI. He's out in Berkeley. He's part of the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Eventually, he ends up relocating to Minneapolis, and he's part of the field office there. And he witnesses a lot of racism among the agents, and particularly because there's a Somali community out there, and they target those people pretty extensively. And they even use slurs like skinny to describe the people around them pretty flippantly, with no consideration at all for what that means. And you find in his profile some very compelling and I guess heavy admissions about the role that he played. He says, "I helped destroy people for 17 years." I think that something that played a big role in him deciding to give documents to The Intercept. Although he actually didn't give documents, he took screenshots of the documents and sent those photographs over to The Intercept in order to do their stories. But he writes, he told Janet, and I put this down just to make sure I read this before when we talked about Terry, he said, "There's this mythology surrounding the war on terrorism and the FBI that has given agents the power to ruin the lives of completely innocent people based solely on what part of the world they came from, or what religion they practiced, or the color of their skin." And then he also said what the FBI was directing us to do was go into these communities and instill fear, and then generate this paranoia within these people so that they know that they're under suspicion perpetually. And so he describes, the sort of things he was able to do and allowed to do as an FBI agent. He could sit across from a mother and he could pressure those people, and he could say, if you don't give me information, we might not give you the green card that you want. You could dangle like immigration visas. You can dangle these things before people and abuse these authorities in order to get them to comply with you. Not only was it looking for information, but there's stuff that he revealed about the coercion of informants. And then I think importantly, the other thing that we see develop and really take hold under President Barack Obama's administration is that whole idea of countering violent extremism and having these things that are called shared responsibility committees. And essentially the idea was that you could get people in a community who were respectable leaders, the ones that are like teachers, let's say imams, religious people, and the such, and having maybe police officers, etc., put them together on a committee and have them be involved in intervening if you see a young person who you think is going to go down the path towards violence. I mean, it's a very In a way, it's like religious profiling for juvenile delinquency. I mean, we have problems with that in this country, but it's just saying specifically that you're going to target Arab, Muslim, and South Asian people and say that they're more susceptible to violence. So it's already got a bad basis in that respect. But then the idea was, and I'll end on this point, the idea was that the FBI would let this community intervene before they got swept up in an investigation. And what Terry points out is that, all this information could be passed back to the FBI. It could be used to form the basis of a criminal investigation. That committee has no idea if the criminal investigation is moving forward, even though they're trying to do something useful for a young person, to make sure that their life isn't destroyed, that they can still have a future. And they can also choose to, if they would like, hold this committee liable later on if that person were to commit an act of violence. So in effect, failing to stop this person from going down the route of terrorism, however that might be defined by the US government, could be something that blows back in the faces of this committee. So you're almost left wondering, why would you even be part of this partnership with the FBI? But that's the kind of toxicity that Terry challenged. And unfortunately, for taking on the FBI, he ended up being sentenced to prison under the Espionage Act.
Yeah, and the shared responsibility committees were an example of something called countering violent extremism, which was a framework that was rolled out, I believe, under Obama as the sort of softer, gentler approach to counterterrorism. But they very heavily rely on what Marjorie was talking about with preventative or predictive policing. The goal is that, or the theory is that you can intervene before someone becomes a terrorist, and there are set paths to how one becomes a terrorist. Violent extremist. How one becomes a violent extremist. And, this has been deployed against the Muslim community in an incredibly racist and Islamophobic way. And the trend since then has been to expand it to other groups, right? My colleague Sue went to a CVE presentation in Washington, D.C. from the U.S. Attorney's Office, where they had stuff in there about Black identity extremists. And they had this bizarre game for middle schoolers that the FBI made, a computer game for middle schoolers to teach them to identify which of their peers in middle school would be terrorists. And the initial version of the game was extremely racist, extremely criticized for that. So they went back and put into it, like animal rights activists and Puerto Rican nationalists like that. And all of this is rested on this theory called radicalization theory, where the FBI basically is saying, there's a set path to becoming a radical. It's when you adopt ideas the FBI don't like, then you go and become a violent extremist, and we're going to intervene before you get to the violent extremist phase, which means intervening based on politically protected speech. And we absolutely saw the Trump administration rolling this out in their task force in response to the George Floyd uprising. And we see a lot of discussions about these types of philosophies in sort of the new framework of going against sort of quote unquote domestic terrorism, where they're taking the discredited and debunked strategies of the international war on terror and sort of the ones that are applied to Muslim communities and applying them to anarchists, to Black Lives Matter, to militias, etc. I just want to ask you one follow-up question. You mentioned that Terry Albury was imprisoned under the Espionage Act. How does this compare to other people who have exposed abuses of the war on terror?
Well, I would say that it's hugely severe. And, he's not the only person. We could go down a list of people and name them for challenging the war on terror framework, or at least key aspects of it. Thomas Drake challenging the idea that a system that is set up to do surveillance to prevent terrorism at minimum should have constitutional safeguards in place, and that the NSA shouldn't be steamrolling over the privacy rights of Americans. That doesn't even get to whether entire populations around the world should have their communications swept up. But at least there's the fact of the Fourth Amendment in the United States, and the NSA is supposed to uphold the Constitution. And yet they went after him and were trying to put him in prison for 40 to 50 years under the Espionage Act. There's John Kiriakou challenging the CIA torture program. We've seen people who challenge the drone program, a targeted assassination complex that has sprouted, declaring that you can launch these strikes anywhere in the world as long as you declare it a part of the battlefield. And Daniel Hale is serving a 45-month sentence right now because he blew the whistle and revealed documents to The Intercept about the drone program. We've seen various aspects of the war on terror framework exposed through documents provided to WikiLeaks by Chelsea Manning. And we've seen the kinds of responses to that. And then I'd add Terry Albury into this group as one of the few people who actually came forward and said something. But, I will say there's this quote that that really strikes me from Dennis Kucinich, who was a representative back in 2006. He was in the Congress. One of the few people who, when you look back at the months after 9/11, who had some prescient comments about what could happen as we went down this path. And he said, and he was speaking about an FBI whistleblower named Colleen Rowley, who had some really important things to share about what the FBI knew before the 9/11 attacks, but they didn't act upon it. And what he said was this: model employees are either ignored or told to keep their mouths shut. Their honesty is not rewarded, but rather they and others in law enforcement, national security, and the intelligence community are punished through a systematic and harsh series of personal and professional retaliations. There's absolutely nothing subtle about the retaliation which whistleblowers face. Scare tactics are used to enforce discipline, to warn other potential whistleblowers against coming forward. National security whistleblowers are subject to harassment, to transfers or demotion or unrelated personal attacks about their sexual activities or personal finances. Instead of examining merits of allegations, the story becomes shifted to the whistleblower's conduct. And there's a number of examples we can go through in the last 20 years. I won't now, so I can let other people speak. But essentially, we have been at a loss for national security whistleblowers, I think, because of the policy of making example out of people who do dare to speak. And there have been a few that have defied that policy. But I think there's probably dozens upon dozens of people within these intelligence agencies who were wanting to speak out but haven't in the last 20 years because of a policy that was embraced by the Bush administration, and you can include Dick Cheney and other officials, along with Obama and his administration, and then the Trump administration ramping this up to well over 100 miles an hour when you look at how they were prosecuting people who wanted to blow the whistle and doing investigations into leaks at even like 3 to 4 times the rate of the Obama administration.
Those are all good points. So far, we've spoken about the moral cost of the war at home, the cost to our democracy, the cost to civil liberties. But Ashik, you've published a new report, State of Insecurity, which focuses on the economic cost of militarization since 9/11. While I've certainly seen many reports that talk about how much the Iraq or Afghanistan wars have cost, as far as I know, this is the first report to include the analysis of the domestic costs, including things like increased spending on the FBI or increased monitoring of immigrant communities. Could you summarize for us the findings of your new report?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me on, and to the other speakers. I'm really glad that we've started this conversation by talking about individual personal stories about the impacts of the war on terror and the human costs of it, because that all too often is abstracted. And especially when we're talking about the financial costs, as we do in our report, it's really important to continue to, really flesh out like what that means for people's lives. So 20 years after 9/11, the war on terror has really remade the U.S. into a far more militarized actor in many ways. Obviously, in our wars abroad, which we hear about the most when these things are discussed, even though that is also pretty abstracted to most people. But the domestic impacts have been really significant. Like the U.S., of course, has always been a pretty militaristic society, but since 9/11, it's really expanded in very significant ways. So we quantified a few different pockets of militarized spending in our analysis. So the military itself, which is by far the largest part, but also Homeland Security, major portions of the Department of Justice and federal law enforcement, as well as the cost of caring for veterans, which is an obligation that, the more the United States goes to war, that's just a major obligation that has to be accounted for. So the total cost over 20 years is 21 trillion, according to our accounting, which is just a really mind-boggling amount. This is all in the name of security. Each year, Congress allocates a discretionary budget. This makes up about 2/3 of it at this point. So about half of that is the military itself, and then another 10 or 11% is for domestic militarized spending, including Homeland Security and federal law enforcement. So of that 21 trillion, 16 trillion went to the military, including about 7 trillion for military contracts, like to private contractors, like weapons manufacturers and private companies that are given public funds for militarized purposes. Another almost $1 trillion went to Homeland Security over 20 years, and about 730 billion went to federal law enforcement. So these are just really astronomical amounts. Like when we're talking about any other domestic priorities, there's often so much haggling over, billions of dollars here and there. And right now there's a big fight over public infrastructure, how many trillions are going to go to that. I think the amount being discussed is 3.5 trillion. So that's a lot of money, but it really pales in comparison to what we're talking about in terms of militarized spending over 20 years, like 21 trillion. So that should really put into perspective any conversations we're having about domestic national priorities or global priorities. We really have to look at the actual costs of what has been committed to militarizing our entire society.
Thank you so much for that. I really look forward to reading your report, although I suspect I will be depressed by it, but it's an important report. So the reason why we're having this call today, or this conference today, is that many people on the panel signed a letter from Defending Rights in Dissent. It was also signed by Noam Chomsky, Marianne Williamson, Lawrence Wilkinson, who was Colin Powell's chief of staff in the run-up to the Iraq War, Tom Drake and John Kiriakou, to Joseph Biden, calling on him to end the war on terror at home, as we are all doing. And it had a very specific list of demands, and I'm very much pleased that they are all good demands. But if Joe Biden was to see your name on this letter and was to give you a call and ask you quickly, what were your priorities for ending the war on terror, what advice would you give him? I don't know who wants to start with that one. You're advising Joe Biden. Marjorie, how about you, since you went first the last time?
I would, tactic, strategy to talk to Biden. It's difficult to say because I can't imagine us talking directly to Biden and him being responsive. And so we need to make our opposition to this so-called war on terror at home as well as abroad by getting together for demonstrations for protected First Amendment activity and fighting voter suppression laws and protecting voter rights, writing op-eds in whatever newspaper national newspapers, local newspapers, writing letters to the editor, which are easy to get published. You just peg it to a news story or an opinion editorial and keep it under 150 or 200 words. And pressuring Congress. Congress members do respond to their constituents because they have to be reelected. They also respond, of course, to the corporations and the defense contractors and the other big funders. But that kind of mass action is what they respond to. And I think we saw that certainly in the wake of the public lynching and torture of George Floyd, where incredible numbers of people all over the world went into the streets after seeing that video of Derek Chauvin's knee on Mr. Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. There were mass protests, and as a result, our whole culture has changed, really. The racism has not gone away because it's always been there, of course. Donald Trump unleashed the dogs of racism, making it okay for racism to take hold in a more public way. The events of January 6th, but shining light on these abuses is the most effective way to take them on and to end them. And it takes concerted activity, concerted effort on many different fronts to challenge, to speak truth to power.
And if people want to contact their member of Congress, there's a little siren at the bottom of the screen. You can see that if you go to rightsindissent.org/take action, you can sign your name to the letter that Marjorie, Kevin, Ashik, Noam Chomsky, Marianne Williamson, myself have all signed, and you can send it to your member of Congress and ask them to take steps to end the war on terror at home, because so many of the things we're talking about, like rolling back the Patriot Act, will require not just Biden, but Congress as well. Dr. Al-Arian, if Biden calls you on the phone and asks you for advice, what would you say to him? And I know this is a bit of a thought exercise, but let's just roll with it.
Well, when the tragic events happened on 9/11, American political leaders had to answer to the American people, why were we attacked? They really had two possible answers. The first, that we were attacked because of our policies, whether it had to do with the sanctions on Iraq that killed 500,000 people, whether it was because of how the many people in the Muslim world thought it was desecration of the birthplace of Islam when American troops landed on Saudi Arabia back in the first Gulf War, whether it was the failure to settle the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and back Israel fully in its brutalization of the Palestinian under occupation, or whether it was the support of authoritarian and dictatorships throughout the Arab and Muslim world. All these American policies, had they said that this is because of our policies, they would have implicated themselves. The other answer was that we were attacked because of our democracy, because of our freedoms, because of who we are. And since we can't change who we are, then we have to go and change who they are. And that's where you had invasions and occupations and drones and black sites and the rendition and Gitmo and Bagram and Abu Ghraib and all the things, the horrors, the torture, things that we've seen in the past 20 years. So what I would advise basically is to go back and take responsibility of what happened, talk about the policies, and hold people accountable. I mean, those people who went to war, they killed millions of people. Literally, millions of people have lost their lives. Trillions of dollars have been wasted. Just look at what happened in Afghanistan just one day before the withdrawal took place. The story was both recited in the Washington Post as well as the New York Times, when the United States military said that they killed a terrorist or someone who was an ISIS person, along with civilians that they took no responsibility for, because he was in a car that had explosives, and with the secondary explosions, other civilian people died. It turned out that every part of that story was a lie, that the person who was killed, or was rather targeted, was a person who was working for an American charity. He was pro-American. He applied to the resettlement program. He'd been working for American charitable organizations for years. 10 people were killed, including 7 children. 7 children that they were basically welcoming him back home when he was being followed for the whole day by someone possibly in North Dakota. And then he pressed a button and suddenly 10 people died because they thought that he probably was an ISIS person without any verification. They didn't even know who he was. Now, this happened thousands of times, not just once or twice. No one was ever held accountable. So I think to be honest with you, what we need to do is hold people accountable for the many excesses that took place. Now, I haven't even talked about what happened domestically. I mean, what happened domestically is it needs to be also investigated by Congress, by independent commissions, get to the bottom of all these manufactured crimes that the FBI has produced, financed, and executed in order to boost their statistics. Hundreds of people were targeted, not because they did any criminal act, but simply because of who they are, because of their names, or because of their appearances, or the color of their skin, or faith, or political opinions. They were targeted, and then they were induced by an army of informants under the direction of the FBI in order for them to say something or implicate themselves in something, not that they had intended to do anything. And now you find there are hundreds of people in prison facing dozens of years, some even life in prison, because they were simply targeted. All these trials, they have to be revisited. All these people are innocent. They haven't, I mean, if you look at the history of all the so-called terrorist prosecutions, 95% or more of them were never really any terrorism. It was something that the FBI concocted, and they did it. And actually, the few terrorist acts that have taken place after 9/11 were the ones that the FBI totally missed, because they were not focusing on real terrorists. They were focusing on Muslim community. And if we had any doubts whatsoever, all what you have to do is to go and reread this New York Times expose of the story of Terry Albury, and you would see the tactics and the tools that have been used by the FBI in order to ensnare this Muslim community. They wanted to, and I think one of your guests read part of it, they want to instill fear and paranoia. They want that community to be unsettled, to be always at edge, because it's the same tactic that was used during the COINTELPRO against the civil rights movement in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. So if there is any advice, we really have to go back, hold people accountable, take another look at the policies, and be honest about it. The people who have committed torture, even Obama, when Obama came to office, what did he do? He said, we're not going to prosecute anybody. What does that tell you? It encourages people actually to pursue these kind of policies.
Thank you so much. That's an excellent answer. And I have a whole bunch of quotes that my colleagues and I pulled out of the Terry Albury New York Times article. One of the things he said on this issue of entrapment and agent provocateurs is, so we catch some kid who doesn't know his ear from his expletive for building a bomb fed to them by the FBI, or we take people from foreign countries where they have secret police, some might say the FBI are a secret police, and recruit them as informants and capitalize on that to ensure their compliance. And another really shocking quote was, but the war on terror is like this game, right? We've built this entire apparatus and convinced the world that there is a terrorist in every mosque and that every newly arrived Muslim immigrant is secretly anti-American. And because we have promoted this false notion, we have to validate it. This is somebody who was in the FBI immediately after 9/11 until 2016 or so when he was arrested, telling us what he witnessed on the inside. And it's worth pointing out how these policies perpetuate further abuses. Donald Trump very infamously had his Muslim ban. The courts asked him to provide a rational reason for it, any reason whatsoever. He kept failing to do so. Then finally he issued, I think it was a second or third executive order, where he cited two cases of examples of terrorism committed by refugees. Both of those cases involved agent provocateurs. One of them a judge found to be an example of imperfect entrapment. So you have the FBI sending agent provocateurs into communities, manufacturing terrorist plots, turning people, many of them very vulnerable, into criminals for things that haven't even happened, and then turning around and saying, this is why we need harsher laws, this is why we need more repression, and allowing a demagogue like Donald Trump to then use that to argue for a Muslim ban in court. And I would be extremely remiss at this moment in time if I did not invite everyone to check out our report on the FBI in the period of 2010 to 2020 called Still Spying on Dissent, the enduring problem of FBI First Amendment abuse, where we talk about the shared responsibility of communities, we talk about the agent provocateurs, we talk about all of these issues. Kevin, do you have any advice for Joe when he calls you?
Yeah, so if Joe Biden gives me a call and we get on the phone, I would first start off by saying, hey, Joe, I saw you at the UN today, and you said that it's the first time in 20 years that the US is not at war. I got some bad news for you, Joe, because we still are on this war footing, and you haven't repealed the authorized use for military force. And that includes the one for Iraq as well as Afghanistan. So we are still at war, even if you remove the U.S. military forces that were occupying Afghanistan. We don't know what's happened with the CIA personnel that were deployed there, and there probably could be some contractors still on the ground in Afghanistan. But you removed the U.S. military forces, and you took a lot of heat for it, I think unfairly from a lot of Republicans, but we're still on a permanent war footing. And so even though you and the man you were vice president for, Barack Obama, had said in his 2012 inauguration speech that he wanted to end perpetual war, we still haven't taken steps to do it. And I think one of the few things you could do to start off is, first, I would suggest what Sammy was saying. We need to stop inventing terrorists. You're preying on entire communities. There's a fantastic documentary that I recommend, not because it'll make you feel good, but because it's very well produced, from Frontline on the Liberty City 7, of these people who were completely preyed upon by the FBI. And they all knew that these men were of no threat whatsoever. They never had weapons except for the ones the FBI were willing to offer to them. They didn't have any ties to any terrorist group except for the ties the FBI were offering to create for them. And they didn't have any plan or a plot to carry out except for the plot that the FBI was willing to help them develop so that they could be the terrorists that they were then going to be arrested. And then they'd have a big press conference, and they told everybody in this part of Miami that is, by the way, impoverished. And then they could go out and say that they caught these people who were terrorists. And then a jury actually doesn't convict them twice. And then it's on the third time, after some really sketchy actions, that they're able to get the sentences they desire, that the Justice Department was finally able to put these men behind bars. And so I would say, stop inventing terrorists. Stop doing that, because Sammy's exactly right that in the process of doing this, the FBI is actually missing people who may or may not pose threats. I mean, I don't know. It's up to them to do that. There's their job. They're law enforcement people. But we do know that they haven't stopped a terrorist attack since 9/11. And that's not because we haven't had times when people were dangerous. You know, the people who have helped to identify potential threats are actually, or to diffuse them, literally diffuse them, have been passengers on airplanes, or have been people who are, I say bystanders or citizens who are paying close watch and do care about their communities. It's not the FBI. None of these tactics have actually done anything to keep people safe. I'd say repeal the AUMF. Joe Biden actually was a senator who voted on the AUMF, gave statements, and I would recommend that he go back and look at the things that were said in the immediate days after 9/11 and look at some of the people who got it right, and look at some of the people who you'd be surprised to learn actually knew what was going to happen, what kind of nightmare lay ahead for us. And I'm gonna stun you a little bit, but Lisa Murkowski, who's a Republican, her father used to be a senator. And in fact, even though he voted for the AUMF, Barbara Lee obviously the person who deserves all the credit for standing up to the authorized use of military force when it comes to giving the president all this power to bomb wherever after 9/11. But he actually said on the Senate floor, "We are flirting with a world war between Islam and the West and the unknown consequences. We can only guess what bin Laden's program is. Is this exactly what he wants? Is that why he did this? If indeed he did." Again, they didn't know at that time that bin Laden was behind the September 11th attacks. It's important for people to remember when they authorized war, they didn't actually know who was responsible for certainty. Well, we can read his speeches and statements. It seems to be all right there. It seems that he really believes that Islam will beat the West. He figures if he can polarize the world into Islam and the West, he has 1 billion soldiers. If the West takes military action against an Islamic nation, would in fact bin Laden welcome that? What could be better from bin Laden's point of view? He would want a war that could last for years and millions would die, not just theirs, but ours. Who has the stomach for that? We know that bin Laden does, but is this really what we want? Discretion is often the better part of valor, even if our stomachs hunger for more. This was a Republican senator 20 years ago who said the one thing that I think Biden needs to hear, which is words that I think he would be willing to utter. Like this thing about discretion being a better part of our valor, even though our stomachs hunger for more, because ultimately everything that we want to see is just ending policies. It's like we're not asking for any programs to be created. We're not asking for any additional funds or monies for anything. It's basically just to stop things that have been going on for the last 20 years that need to be ended right now. And I'll just conclude on brand and say that one of those policies also should be looking at people who have had these crises of conscience, had the courage to come forward and say what was on their minds and speak out against the security state, to challenge the war on terrorism framework and treat them as heroes. Maybe go back and pardon some of these people who should not have been prosecuted, and then admit that we made a colossal mistake as far as this idea of moving forward without looking backward, and that there needs to be some kind of accountability, or else we're going to continue to see this get worse and worse as far as the war on terror at home goes, with people taking matters into their own hands and abusing their authority. And there's been no accountability at all. So people within every national security institution, and I left out Edward Snowden when I talked about whistleblowers earlier, but all of these people who have brought forward revelations, anyone they implicated has gotten off scot-free, and they've been able to tour the media and put out their books, and they've been able to defend their failed policies that have been discredited, and they continue to go on speaking tours and get paid hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to be part of panels, not like this one, but they get to still have this prestige, and it hasn't been taken away because the government has done nothing to take away that prestige from them.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I think that was an excellent answer, and I'm happy you mentioned a documentary film, because I know you are doing a series on the dissenter of cinema and 9/11, which has been extremely interesting to read. Ashik, Joe Biden calls you. He saw your name on our letter. What are you going to say to him?
Yeah, I would say overall, the massive investments in militarization over the past 20 years of the war on terror have made this whole country and the entire world less safe. It's caused so much harm with massive human costs, like mass incarceration, widespread surveillance, the violent repression of immigrant communities, and hundreds of thousands of lives lost to war and violence. Like, this has just caused harm. It's bad. It needs to end. Overall, there are a bunch of concrete ways to do that, which are too numerous to list here. We lay out a bunch of things in our report that we think are worth shifting resources away from. But I would say overall, there are three things I would emphasize. One is that it's like, in some ways, this administration has been de-emphasizing the war on terror, which is good, even though a lot of things continue, as we've been talking about. It's good that the war in Afghanistan is finally winding down, for example, or at least the U.S. is removing much of its military presence there. But there's a real danger in just shifting from the war on terror to a war or preparing for war against China and wrapping up tensions with what are seen as emerging great powers that threaten the United States. That is just a recipe to continue and exacerbate a lot of what we're talking about: the repression of communities within the U.S. And racializing communities within the United States. Throughout the war on terror, Muslims and people who are perceived as Muslim have been racialized and targeted, and this has increased tensions in many communities. There's a long history in the United States of racializing East Asian people, and that can easily be tapped into if the state is actively encouraging it with the rhetoric that is ramping up tensions with China right now. So I would say don't do that. don't ramp up tensions with China when we need global cooperation against so many great systemic threats like pandemics, like climate crisis. So that's one. Another is actually end a lot of these programs domestically that shift military resources to Homeland Security, to police, border enforcement. So many military weapons and resources are turning police departments into forces that are equipped to wage war on communities. And this has also all sorts of consequences. But there are specific programs like the 1033 program, which has existed for decades and shifted military weapons and resources to police departments. Obama briefly put a moratorium on it. Trump brought it back. That's something that can just be ended permanently. And there are a number of amendments being proposed to bills right now that could be acted on. And the last thing I would say is actually shift resources, like on the order of trillions of dollars, away from militarizing our country and toward actually meeting systemic challenges like climate crisis, like ending homelessness. That would all be way cheaper than continuing to militarize our society. For something like a quarter of $21 trillion that has been spent on militarizing the United States and the world over the past 20 years, we could, for example, have a fully renewable electricity grid. So, and ending homelessness would be something like $20 billion to create enough housing for all people who are currently unhoused. So there are all sorts of things that are very possible, but the political will does not exist. And right now, the incentives are all for politicians or toward just continuing to police and enforce violence. And that's something that we can really organize for over the next decade or two.
And with the pivot to China, with sort of the emerging new Cold War framework, we are seeing the FBI ramping up suspicion of Chinese Americans, treating Chinese Americans as spies. We plan to have sometime in the future a program with Pat Eddington on the China Initiative, which has been a very sort of troubling program of the FBI. So really, we should be saying end the war on terror at home. Please don't start a new Cold War at home either. Ashik, you and I talked a little bit about this behind the scenes, so I want to give you a chance to answer this. Would you like to share some of your sort of personal observations about the war on terror?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in New York City after 9/11, and my family is Muslim. My parents are immigrants from Bangladesh. So I was preteen when 9/11 happened. I had family members who were at or near Ground Zero when the planes hit. So my family really had a personal experience on that day with how horrific it was. And then it was really alarming in the days and weeks and months after that to see the way that the government wielded that event to create this massive apparatus that then targeted many people that we knew. I had family members who were surveilled by police in New York City. I know like entire communities of people who had to move away from New York City because they felt threatened because of their immigration status. And there were just all sorts of, reverberating effects in Muslim immigrant communities in 9/11 after that, in the years after 9/11, where just whole communities were uprooted or felt like they had to keep their heads down at work or, just not just feel very paranoid. And that's something that really personally has shaped my politics, obviously, in doing the work that I'm doing now. And I hope that more of my peers feel empowered to express their politics now, and the need to shift away from the fear and paranoia that a lot of us have felt for decades.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I know some people find sharing experience like that to be very cathartic. Others, it's too painful to talk about. So I'm really glad we could give you a space to talk about that today. My next question is sort of so one of the things that I think is really important to remember is that a lot of the policies we are fighting are extensions of escalations of pre-9/11 policies. Sometimes you'll hear people say, in this sort of context, they want to roll back the clock to September the 10th, 2001, or they want to restore, the Constitution or things like that. Now, Defending Rights and Dissent existed on September the 10th, 2001. We've existed since 1960, and we didn't really have a shortage of affronts to civil liberties to combat. And we were working with organizations like the one Sammy started. We were working with organizations like the National Lawyers Guild and Ashik. I know IPS and your colleague Phyllis Bennis was very concerned with the fact that U.S. was bombing Iraq once every 3 days without congressional authorization back then. We often sort of talk about the forever war and the erosion of constitutional war powers post 9/11. But, in the run up to 9/11, we were bombing Iraq once every 3 days. One of Bush's first acts in office in February of 2001 is to bomb outside the no-fly zone in a dramatic escalation. This is before the war, quote unquote, started. So I guess my question for you all is, how should we view the era after 9/11 in relationship to what came before it? Obviously, I think no one here wants to romanticize the pre-9/11 era, even though it would be an improvement over what we have now. And how does this influence how we should move forward? And I don't know who wants to take that question. Marjorie, we haven't heard from you from a while. Would you like to lead off with that? Marjorie, I think you're muted. All of our guests are so polite. They mute themselves when others are talking, and then we can't hear them when they are talking.
Muted. I'm getting feedback. Can you hear me?
No. I mean, we can hear you multiple times over. Are you unmuted still, or?
Oh, let's see. Okay. How's that?
That's still echoing. Do you have headphones or something you could put on? I don't know.
Okay, let me look for headphones. Just a minute.
Sure. Why don't we go to Sammy, since you have a lot of experiences with organizing with our organization back when it was the National Coalition Against Repressive Legislation during the Clinton years. Right. Unfortunately, a lot of the same problems we're talking about today.
Well, a lot of people may probably or don't understand or don't know that the origins of the Patriot Act started back in '95. That's when we started looking into this, where the different parts of the Patriot Act was presented to Congress. A couple of times they were rejected. Then they went into the Effective Death Penalty Act of '96. A lot of these policies were instituted. Part of it was the use of secret evidence. That's what we organized, the National Coalition to Protect Political Freedom between '97 and 2001. We were able to lobby and do really a lot of work, which I would recommend that civic organizations start organizing. We had a education campaign, a public campaign, where we were going city to city, community to community, talking about the issue of secret evidence, trying to educate people what it was and how dangerous it was and how it was targeting at the time. This is prior to 9/11. The Arab and Muslim community. Out of the 29 cases that were used, 28 were Arabs and Muslims. We also started the media campaign. We were able to generate in a couple of years over 50 editorials decrying and condemning the use of secret evidence, over 200 featured articles about the victims of secret evidence, how it was used. We coined the term, and once the government started using judges the word secret evidence, we knew we won it. It's just a matter of time. We also had a legal campaign in the courts. We were challenging every part of that use of the secret evidence. And then we had a political campaign. We were able to introduce a legislation in Congress, 2121, HR 2121, the repeal, the Secret Evidence Repeal Act at the time. We were able to get into the Judiciary Committee, had a markup. We won that vote 28-2. Then we moved into the full Congress. Unfortunately, it was the 2000 campaign, so we ran out of time. But we renewed that effort. We had over 129 Congress people lining and co-sponsoring the bill. Now today we have what is called the EGO bill. The EGO bill is trying to revisit most of these cases where people were entrapped or were they prosecuted because of their association or political beliefs. We believe that this EGO bill, if it gets a hearing and if it passes, it's going to correct or trying to readdress many of the excesses of the so-called war and terror. I also want to point out, you talked about the history of the United States and the history of repression, that there is also racism that we can see today in cases involving Arabs and Muslims. I want to point out to one case where the victim was a Palestinian American. He was arrested in Saudi Arabia. His name is Ahmed Abu Ali. And he was arrested in Saudi Arabia and tortured at the direction of the FBI. And when his family pressed his case here in the United States, where a judge demanded to know his whereabouts, he was charged with a crime. He was brought in from Saudi Arabia in order to cover up the torture. He was charged with trying to assassinate, believe it or not, a 22-year-old President Bush, the President of the United States at the time. That was his charge. And he was convicted, where the torture was denied to the jury, even though it was plainly shown on his backs. And then the government, he was sentenced to 30 years. The government wasn't satisfied. They appealed, and he ended up with life in prison. And the same case, but this time it was an American boy, a white male, somebody who was a veteran of Iraq. His name was Timothy Joyner from Georgia, who actually plotted to kill the President of the United States, Obama at the time. He bought $87,000 worth of bombing material. And he had some partners, but they had cold feet. So they went to the FBI telling about the plot. He was arrested. He confessed. And the judge thought that he still was a young man, same age, 24 years of age. And he sentenced him to 5 years. So we have two cases. One where there is no plot, just an accusation, an admission under torture that was taken at face value, where the victim was sentenced to life because he was a Palestinian and Muslim. And a white male who actually had bombing material, who actually had the threat, who actually had the plot, who actually was going to assassinate the President of the United States. He was caught and he was sentenced to 5 years. So you could see the racism taking place, not just in society at large, but also within the legal system. So we really need to go back and readdress this. But back to what we need to do. We need political campaigns, we need legal campaigns, media campaigns, public campaigns, education campaigns, the whole 9 yards. We need to build these coalitions, these organizations that believe in the principles of what this country was supposed to have been built upon. The freedoms, the democratic nature of the state, the human rights, the civil rights, all these things that people fight for and willing to die for. We need to start organizing, mobilizing, and getting people together so that we can fight these repressive policies that have been instituted because or under the guise of 9/11.
Thank you so much for that history. I know that, like I said, Defending Right and Dissent's predecessor organization, the National Coalition Against Repressive Legislation, which was led by Kit Gage, was very active in your organization and in the campaign to abolish secret evidence. And I believe presidential candidate George W. Bush suggested that perhaps secret evidence had gone too far and the Clinton administration was guilty of racial profiling. That one took a different turn, but that's always worth remembering. Is Marjorie back, or have we just lost her?
Okay.
You're still echoing pretty heavily.
Yeah.
Okay. Kevin, while we're waiting for Marjorie to fix that, do you have any thoughts on this question? I know maybe it's a little outside your realm, but
Well, just maybe because of age and a focus on the war on terrorism and having so much to work with over the last 20 years, I haven't looked too deeply into the period in the 90s. But I'm aware that Ronald Reagan is largely responsible for a development of a kind of counterterrorism framework. He wanted to use it in response to Libya. And there were things that he did that were precursors to what we saw after September 11th. And so everything was percolating beneath the surface. And when I listened to your question, I think what's really the most critical thing for people to do is we need to untangle personality. You could say this for almost any issue in the United States. And I don't profess to know that this is unique to the United States. But here in the US, what we need to do is disentangle everything we've said today about the war on terror at home from these political personalities. We need to disentangle it from Donald Trump, disentangle it from Barack Obama, disentangle it from George W. Bush, and even Dick Cheney and some of the people we think are even more sinister than presidents, perhaps, because we've heard about what they did in the shadows in order to perpetuate this war on terror at home and abroad. And we need to recognize the different entrenched systems and note the things that existed before, as you rightly point out, and Dr. Sammy points out. And we need to not only respond have a full-blown response to ending the things that were escalated, but also based on what we've learned, we need to have a kind of memory collectively about what we've seen happen in the last 20 years that says that maybe we even go back further. Perhaps we even want to go back to the 1970s when we were having these committees that took a close investigation into what kind of authorities we had on the books, what were people being permitted to do, how was it all being abused, and get into public conversations about things that I think are mostly taboo still even today. And that would include things like material support for terrorism investigations. You held up your report, Still Spying, and what you looked into. And I'm based here in Chicago. And when I was going through college in 2010, in September, there were about a couple dozen anti-war activists or international solidarity activists who had their homes raided under Obama's administration. And they were targeted by an undercover informant who went by the name of Karen Sullivan. And she ended up tagging along with them when they were working on putting together a march that would go on outside of the Republican National Convention in 2008. And in some way or another, she stayed in the circle around them and did and had interactions with them for at least 2 or 3 years before she disappeared. And toward the end of her time, when the FBI was extremely anxious to put together a case, and I think you cite my work in the Still Spying report.
We do multiple times on this issue.
Because I think I was like one of the only journalists to dig into this affidavit or look at these unsealed materials that came from this case, where it shows that this woman who went by the name of Karen Sullivan told these activists, made up the story. What they do is they really make up these tearjerker stories. And she says, my father died, and on his deathbed, he wanted someone to send $1,000 to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which the United States has designated as a terrorist organization. And we'll set the politics of that aside for the moment and just say that if you did that, you could be prosecuted for committing a crime. So she's trying to get these activists by saying, this is something my father wanted. And she even shows this documentary, or they're watching this documentary, Women in Struggle, which features someone named Razmia Ode, who subsequently, after these activists were targeted and for entrapment, because they failed to get any criminal cases out of that, they turn around and then go after this well-respected, stalwart figure who was in the Chicago Arab American community here and had done a lot for women, and who was tortured by the Israeli military. And that's how she ended up in the United States, because through her resistance as a Palestinian woman, she ended up being tortured. And then eventually she ended up getting some help from the State Department to resettle in the US. And that's documented. And yet they went after her and said that she lied on her immigration forms to get her deported. All of these cases, by the way, fell apart. All these activists remained under a cloud of investigation for like a decade, until finally the statute of limitations elapsed in 2020. Nothing ever happened. But nonetheless, people were pursued because they were solidarity activists with Palestine or solidarity activists with people in Colombia. And the government tried to go after them for material support for terrorism. And that's not an issue that we debate in this country. We talk about, closing Guantanamo, we need to close Guantanamo. Talk about privacy rights, we need to end the surveillance state. You talk about things of that nature, but these things on the books like material support for terrorism, those are kind of there in the 90s before we have the September 11th attack. So we need to bring those into our frame of debate. And we need to talk. Yeah, go ahead, Chip.
And Defending Rights and Dissent opposed the material support statute when it was passed in 1997. That was why we published the first edition of David Cole and James Dempsey's book, Terrorism of the Constitution. After 9/11, it was updated with the Patriot Act and all of those other atrocities and republished by the New Press. But the very first edition was published by our organization in response to the material support statute. And Kevin did excellent reporting on that case. I recommend reading it. It's covered in the report. And I will say, I think we can expect some more documents on that case very soon, because people have for years filed FOIAs, and the FBI has claimed no such documents existed. I filed a FOIA and did not get any documents about what happened in the Twin Cities. And I took the affidavit, the one that was unsealed that Kevin wrote about, probable cause affidavit, and I used it in the basis of an appeal to the Office of Information Policy within the DOJ, and the DOJ has demanded that the FBI reopen my FOIA request and search for additional documents. So we are hopefully on the cusp of finally opening those files. 10 years later, but, still worth it. Ashik, do you have any thoughts on this question of sort of how do we move forward without romanticizing a pre-9/11 America that wasn't totally there? Or do you want to just go into final thoughts since we're
Sure, yeah, I can just quickly answer the question, which is a good one, because I think they're like being at the National Priorities Project, which started at in the 80s to resist a lot of militarism at the height of the Cold War with Ronald Reagan, and NPP has since joined Institute for Policy Studies, which started in the 1960s to resist the Vietnam War. So I think there are a bunch of inflection points that have put the United States on this track toward like really hyper militarism, like since World War II and the Red Scare and intense anti-communism, and then like the rise of neoliberalism in the 70s and 80s that started like dismantling like public investment in the welfare state, but increasing investment in militarism. So there are a lot of things that were already happening for many decades before 9/11. But I think a useful thing to point to is after the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, there was a big push within the United States for something called a peace dividend, like to reinvest major resources that had been put into the military at that point, and reinvesting that into public goods, into actually building public infrastructure and public services for all the people, like working class people in the United States who had been chipped away at for many decades. So there was talk about that in both parties. It was sort of a bipartisan push to figure out what to do with that peace dividend. And then that just didn't happen during the Clinton administration for a bunch of reasons. But there were sort of social forces that were for it, like big labor unions that included many workers who worked in military industrial factories were thinking about like how to shift jobs. So there were really important conversations happening that had political influence for a number of years. And then that, by 9/11, that was just no longer a prospect at all. So I think there's a lot we can do to look at what accounted for why that didn't happen even before 9/11 and how to address those gaps going forward in organizing over the next decade or two. And there were a number of movements before 9/11, like the alter globalization movements that were, thinking about what a new, better economic order could be for the global economy. So I think there were different tracks that maybe could have been taken if not for 9/11 and how it was wielded politically. There's a very different political context today that we can think about.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you for bringing up national priority projects and IPS's origins. Defending Rights and Dissent was founded by the merger of two groups. One, Bill of Rights Defense Committee, responded in response to the Patriot Act. The other, the National Coalition to Abolish the House Un-American Activities Committee, which was founded to take on HUAC. So I used to have a picture of HUAC behind me that my cat removed while redecorating, and I got this bookshelf instead. But no, to sort of point, these are long-term struggles. These are long-term fights. I'm going to move in. We have 7 minutes left. I'm going to move into the final thoughts section. And if we're not echoing this time, I'm going to give Marjorie the floor.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect this time.
Okay, great. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. I just had a couple of comments from before. One is that before 9/11, there was a move in Congress to enact many of the provisions that ultimately were enacted in the Patriot Act very shortly after 9/11. I think it was like 3 weeks later, with almost no debate at all. It was a 300 and some page bill where a lot of the Congress members didn't even know what they were voting on. I think ACLU staffers got calls the day after they voted on the Patriot Act to find out what they had adopted. And then the other thing I wanted to say is, speaking to Biden, I would ask him why he is pursuing the prosecution of Julian Assange, whose name has not been mentioned yet here today. I mean, Chelsea Manning did provide documents and that actually provide evidence of U.S. war crimes in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Guantanamo. And Julian Assange and WikiLeaks published that evidence of war crimes in 2010 and 2011. And Obama, who prosecuted more whistleblowers under the Espionage Act than all prior presidents combined, thought about indicting Julian Assange and decided not to because of what they called the New York Times problem, because WikiLeaks did the same thing that New York Times, The Guardian, Le Monde, Der Spiegel did, which was to publish this evidence that was provided by Chelsea Manning. So Obama, who was notorious at prosecuting whistleblowers, did not prosecute Assange. Along comes Donald Trump. He files charges against Julian Assange. He is now facing 175 years in prison. Britain has denied the Trump administration's request to extradite Assange back to the United States, that it was denied on humanitarian grounds. But now Biden is pursuing Trump's appeal and trying to get Julian Assange back, to the United States to try him for revealing evidence of U.S. war crimes. So I would ask Biden, why did you change the policy from that of your good buddy Barack and go and continue this appeal against Assange? You should drop the charges immediately.
Thank you so much for mentioning Julian. In our letter to Biden that we've all signed, that we're asking you to sign at rightsanddissent.org/take action, Julian Assange is mentioned by name because his case has been extremely important to defending rights and dissent and extremely important to everyone who values the future of free press and the ability to expose war crimes. Sammy, what are your final thoughts today? You're muted as well. our polite panelists, all muting when their panelists are talking and then mute themselves. I think we can hear you now.
Very well. Thank you very much for inviting me and for having this lovely and lively discussion. I just hope that all the organizations that have been organizing, mobilizing, and resisting, they can come together in the same spirit we came together in the 70s trying to fight secret evidence. I think we need to bring, the Coalition for Civil Freedoms, the Defending Rights and Dissent, and all the other organizations together to strategize and work together in tandem in order to press. I think we have a good opportunity, a golden opportunity now with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And my final announcement really is that the Coalition for Civil Freedom, CCF, is going to release a report on October, I believe, the 4th week, which is the week that Afghanistan was invaded back 20 years ago, called the Terror Trap. And then they're going to have a conference, 6 panels, and then a congressional hearing about all these excesses. In addition to that, they will also have a War and Terror film festival every weekend in October, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. They will screen 20 films that were produced in the past 20 years that deal with the so-called war and terror. Some of the best and finest films will be screened. So I hope everybody's going to tune in and support this effort. Thank you very much.
And for people who want to go to that conference and go to that film festival, where can they get the information?
I think both on CCF website and also the film festival has its own website. I think it's called wotfilmfestival.com.
And we'll make sure people watching they get those links, because I was looking at the film festival website before I came on, and I'm super excited for it. Ashik, what are your final?
They're going to have all these people.
No, it's really impressive what you put together. I'm jealous. Ashik, would you like to give us your final thoughts? Ashik, you're also muted. You are following in our tradition of muted speakers.
Yeah, I would just end by saying we've talked about a lot of heavy stuff today. The report that I worked on lays out stuff that is certainly pretty bleak, and laying out all of the national priorities we've had over the past 20 years and longer. But I think it's really worth pointing to the fact that that such massives can be made. It shows that we can have the capacity and political will to invest in other priorities. There are lots of very big, expensive things that are totally worth doing, that we have to do if we want to, survive as a society against climate change and inequality and like ending racism. There are just all these major social ills that have been part of our society forever, and it's actually possible to deal with them. There are many struggles to be had over the next years and decades to come. But I think we really have a big opportunity after 2 decades of such massive failure to really reframe and reorient our politics in this country.
Thank you so much, Ashik. And Kevin, just very briefly, we're at the tail end of the broadcast. Your final thoughts.
I'll be very quick and just say that I think I would caution people to be careful about how much they say, we already know this. Like, if you listen to this panel today and you thought all of this information, and you're getting sick and tired of these same conversations about the war on terrorism, I would say it's really the incorrect attitude, because there are plenty of people out there who we have a whole new generation of people who don't really know the genesis of all of these policies. But also, I think you owe it to everyone who has suffered and who has gone through these policies to constantly refresh your memory and seek out new information that adds detail to what we have been talking about today, so that you can go around and you can be an advocate for ending the war on terror at home.
That is such an excellent point, Kevin. A few years back, I was invited to speak at a conference on a college campus, and there were people in attendance who were not alive when 9/11 had happened. And I was like, what? How can that be? But I mean, this is something that we all lived through. But for a lot of people, this is like hearing about Pearl Harbor or the sinking of the Lusitania or something like that. And these are vital conversations to have. I am so proud to have been part of this panel. This has been an amazing group of panelists, and I was so proud to be part of this letter. If you'd like to be part of our letter too, you can go to rightsanddissent.org/takeaction. Add your name to the letter that our distinguished panelists have signed, along with Noam Chomsky, Abdeen Jabara, Marianne Williamson, Lawrence Wilkinson, Tom Drake, John Kariakou, Matthew Ho, Colleen Rowley, and so many others. And when you do that on our action page, it will send the letter to your member of Congress. So every one of your members of Congress will see the demands that we're raising, that you're raising, and you can be part of our movement to end the war on terror, not just abroad, but at home. Thank you so much for joining us, and this concludes our broadcast.
Thank you. Say hi to Sue and Kit for me.
I will.